This is Cullendulla Creek Nature Reserve. It's a very important part of Bateman's Marine Park. It has many different types of marine environment. We're standing here on a rock platform. It has a big tidal sand flat, and it also has an estuary where the rivers meet the marine environment. Where all these places interact, it creates lots and lots of different types of habitat, and habitat is where animals live. The rock platforms can be a hard place to live because they're dry at low tide and wet at high tide, so animals that live here have to adapt. Just in here, in this little hole and crevice here, you can see all those Nerita shells, they're all clustered together and there's a little bit of water in there. That stops them drying out in the low tide. And you can see this oyster here, this one's still alive, it's all closed up, so it locks all the water in there during low tide, so it can survive the low tide. We're on the beach now. And even though the beach sometimes looks like there's not a lot of living things, if you have a look at all these shells were once a living thing, and it gives you an idea of how many different animals live here. That's a razor clam, there's those Nerita shells again, there's a native mussel there. These little ones are really interesting. They're actually formed by a worm. They make a tube, and then the little worm lives in there. This one's called a mud oyster, and they burrow down into the sand and the mud. So there's lots and lots of different living things, and if you count up all the different animals here, all of those live in the sand or on the rocks nearby. Sometimes we don't just find shells and animals on the beach, we find rubbish, and we call this marine debris. And this one here is a bit of plastic. That might get tangled around the leg of a bird. So it's important when you come down the beach, if you see plastic and bits of rubbish, to pick it up and take it home and put it in the bin. Where we're standing now is what's called the intertidal sand flat. Even though this may look like there's not much living here, there's a lot of life in this sand, and it's very important for animals like stingrays. So when this is all underwater at high tide, the stingrays come in and they use their flaps to dig these holes, and they've got a mouth with crushing teeth in them. So they can suck in all the shells, crush all the shells, and they eat the animals inside. So you can see where they've gone through here, and they've quite literally just dug up the intertidal sand flat and sifted through the sand to get their food out. But at low tide, there's another shift moves in, and that's the birds. So you can see there's things like oyster catchers, there's curlews, spoonbills. The animals, they adapt to that by burrowing deep into the sand. So that's why you see birds like oyster catchers with long, skinny beaks, so they too can burrow into the sand to get the animals. This sign here tells you where you're allowed to fish and where you can't fish. So when you're in a habitat protection zone, this yellow part here, you can go recreational fishing, and even some types of professional fishing are allowed in a habitat protection zone. But this over here is a sanctuary zone. So in the mouth of Cullendulla Creek, all the way up to the end of the creek is a sanctuary zone. And those areas are put aside just for the plants, the animals and the habitat. They're areas where you're allowed to go kayaking and do all sorts of recreational activities, but you're not allowed to harm the animals or plants that are there. So that includes activities like fishing, and in this case you can't do boating, and it's all aimed at protecting these very important areas. Fish can come in and they can breed. It's where the younger fish can grow up, and then once they grow up they can leave the sanctuary zone and go and populate other areas. So now we're in a different type of habitat. This is a mangrove habitat. So mangroves are very special because they can adapt to a very, very salty environment. Not a lot of plants can do that. When they suck up all that salt in the water, they pretty well just sweat it out through their leaves. And when it rains, all the salt washes off. The other clever thing that they can do is that they can breathe when the tide comes up. So they put up things called pneumatophores, and they're these spiky things you can see down in there. So that allows them to exchange oxygen or breathe when they're underwater. And then when the tide goes out, they're just like a normal plant. So there's one more type of habitat I want to talk about, and that's seagrass. We can't see that because it's under the water, but seagrass is also very important for fish, and it also is very important for the river itself because it holds all the sediment together and it helps form all the little sandbanks and channels that we see, as do the mangroves. But during low tide like this, the smaller fish need to hide from the birds and bigger fish, so they'll go and hide in amongst all the seagrass, and it gives them a little bit of protection. Then there's other animals that live in there all the time, like little tiny seahorses, and there's some octopus that live in there as well. It's also eaten directly by the black swans. They're vegetarians, so they love to eat the seagrass as well. So when you come down to the sand flats at Cullendulla on your next walk, just pay attention to all the animals that live here. So the sand might look like there's nothing living there, but if you have a walk around, you can see all those tracks, you can see all the little holes, you can see all those little balls of sand that have been made by the crabs, you see the tracks left by the birds, you can see the holes left by the stingrays. All these systems connected together. Even though you might think, oh, I can't see anything today, if you look very, very closely, this place is full of life.